Check, check, check. Hey.
Okay, we'll go ahead and get started here. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the National World War II Museum. I'm Pete Crane, the Vice President of Education and Access here at the National World War II Museum. And it's our pleasure to welcome everyone, and especially the Killian family. No pressure being up here with the whole family watching us. But it's our pleasure to welcome you to A Black Soldier's Letters Home, a special program highlighting the wartime correspondence of James "Kid" Killian Jr. But first I'd like to start with a tradition that we have here at the World War II Museum, and unfortunately I don't see any in here, but we like to recognize our World War II veterans. So although we don't have any with us here, I'm hoping we have some online. So let's give a round of applause and recognition to those who served in World War II. I'd also like to recognize any other veterans, active duty military, or military spouses who are with us in the audience. Do we have any veterans wore the uniform at any time? Thank you for joining us. I'd also like to recognize the leaders who help keep us going here at the National World War II Museum. That would be our Board of Trustees and Patriot Circle and Charter members, whether in attendance or joining us online. Thank you also for everything you do for the National World War II Museum. But this morning we're here to recognize an individual soldier, a soldier who did not come into the Army originally as a result of the Japanese bombing on Pearl Harbor, but someone who actually had joined the Army before the war and had actually served and gotten out of the Army before the war, but was recalled when we went to war. And I'm not going to get too much into his personal story because we're going to be talking about that with the family here. But first, let's set the scene. You know, when most people think of African Americans in World War II, immediately the thought Tuskegee Airmen comes to mind. But that's one piece, one very important piece of a much larger picture. Well, let's go back. African Americans have served in the military since before there was a United States. With the sacrifice of Crispus Attucks at the Boston Massacre, the first African American fell for our country. In the Civil War, the 54th Massachusetts earned medals of honor for their attacks against the Confederacy. The 9th and 10th U.S. Cavalry, the Buffalo Soldiers, served with distinction on the prairies and in the constabulary period of our nation's advancement. In World War I, the Harlem Hellfighters, or the 369th Infantry, fought with distinction in France. In fact, African-American units had some of the highest rates of combat and continuous service in the war and fought mainly under French leadership. But those soldiers coming back from World War I came back to a country that still did not treat them as equal citizens. Post-World War I, there were race riots that veterans had to come back and fight to. In 1925, there was a paper issued by the U.S. Army War College that was used as a basis of further discrimination that said that African Americans did not have the intellectual capacity to be leaders and good soldiers. Obviously, they had been proven wrong, but that was an attempt for retrenchment to go back to and support segregated ways. In January 1941, before Pearl Harbor was attacked, there were only 4,000 African-American service members. There were 12 officers, only 12 in the entire U.S. military, and there were no African-American Marines. In June 1941, things were beginning to change. Executive Order 8802, signed by President Roosevelt, banned discriminatory employment practices by federal agencies and all unions and companies engaged in wartime, war-related work. The order also established, for the first time, a Fair Employment Practices Commission to enforce the new policy. But of course, that policy was never really enforced across the board. We still had entrenched segregation. The largest black newspaper of the country, the Pittsburgh Courier, started and popularized the Double V campaign, standing for Victory Abroad and Victory at Home. So you've heard of the famous Tuskegee Airmen, but they only represented about 10 to 15,000 service members in the war, including a small number of women, a fact that is often overlooked. But they are only part of a great story. There were 1.2 million African Americans in uniform in World War II. So where did that other 1.19 million African Americans serve? Well, they served across the services. As I said, the Marines, when Pearl Harbor was attacked, had no African Americans serving in it. They were the last service to allow African Americans to serve. That was not until 6 months after Pearl Harbor in June of 1942. So what were most African Americans doing? The Army had the lion's share. And most African Americans were serving in logistics units and support units. Units like the Red Ball Express. We often hear of Patton's drive across France, but that was enabled by truck drivers in what were then called segregated or colored regiments, truck driving regiments. There were black soldiers on Omaha Beach on Pearl Harbor on June 6, 1944. The 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, say that 5 times fast. The 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion was on Omaha Beach on D-Day. And when you see pictures of Omaha Beach on D-Day and you see those balloons up in the air, they were kept there by the 320th. They kept the enemy fighter planes from strafing the beaches. 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers, were fighting in Italy. The 761st Tank Battalion, or the Black Panthers, served with distinction. There was an all-black paratrooper unit, the 555th, the Triple Nickel, who, while they were never able to deploy overseas, they were kept in the United States to fight what was considered to be a significant threat, firebombing by the Japanese. They invented the practice of smoke jumping, meaning jumping into remote forests to fight forest fires, and they did so with distinction. There was also now gaining prominence now with the recent issuance by Congress of a Congressional Gold Medal. The 688th Postal Directory Battalion was a unit of all black women who served in the WACs in Great Britain and in France to keep the mail moving. In the Navy, at the beginning of the war, there was one rating that you could have, or one military occupational specialty that you could have, You could be a messmate or mess steward. But there were 2 ships in the Navy during World War II that were crewed by almost entirely black crews. There was the USS Mason, a destroyer, and the USS PC-1264. It didn't even have a name. It was a submarine chaser. But these 2 ships were manned by African Americans as a result of a letter sent to President Roosevelt by the NAACP in December of 1941. In 1944, the Mason was used for convoy duties in the Battle of the Atlantic and did so throughout the remainder of the war. As I said, the Marines were the last service to admit African Americans and would not allow African Americans to train at the main Marine bases. They had to have their own separate base at Montford Point, therefore creating the term that is now a term of distinction, the Montford Point Marines. Montford Point Marines served on Saipan, Iwo Jima, New Guinea, Peleliu, the major battles of World War II in the Pacific. Anyone want to guess how many African Americans were awarded the Medal of Honor during World War II? That answer is a trick question. There were none. But in 1997, January 13th, 1997, President Bill Clinton awarded the medal to 7 African Americans. Unfortunately, only Vernon Baker was still alive to receive his medal. But those were the Medal of Honor recipients. And actually, I want to say each one of their names because they need to be said. Lieutenant Charles Thomas, Vernon Baker, Private Willie James Jr., Sergeant First Class Ed Allen Carter, an amazing story. You want to do some research on him. Private George Watson, a proud quartermaster, and Staff Sergeant Rubin, and Lieutenant John Fox. Those are the Medal of Honor recipients, but most African American service members were not put into positions where they had to earn and lay down a sacrifice of the Medal of Honor. They fought, they served, they longed for their families at home, they suffered indignities by a system that treated them poorly, they helped win the war abroad, and then they came home to help make a better world for all of us. Soldiers today stand on their shoulders. So now we get to talk about one of those soldiers, James Killian Jr. To hear about James's experience, we'll be hearing shortly from his children. We have James Killion III, a retired Vice President of Sales and Sales Operations at Merritt's. Carol Killian Hudson, a registered nurse and college health instructor and retired hospital administrator. Dr. Cheryl Killian, an anthropologist and registered nurse who is also an associate professor with the Francis Payne Bolton School of Nursing at Case Western Reserve University. And Michelle Killian Keeper, a speech language pathologist and retired educator. They're joined by our own Kim Guise, National World War II Museum Senior Curator and Director of Curatorial Services, and they're going to participate in an interview about their father's experience and correspondence. So please join me in welcoming this great family.
Thank you, Colonel Crane. Is that on? Okay, wonderful. You all sat in order. You must have practiced this, huh? I'd like to welcome all of you, and I'd like to ask, we have such a large and beautiful representation from the Killian family today. I would like to ask all of the Killian family members to just give a wave. Thank you all. So I'm so pleased to be here with you today. As a curator at the National World War II Museum, one of my primary functions is to hear from and to meet with artifact owners. Most of the material that the museum has in our collection comes directly from veterans and their families. And families like you who are willing to share what's often very personal material, and I know that's not an easy process. Sometimes wartime artifacts arrive in the mail, in packages sent across the country, but when families are able to come to the museum and come together, usually not in a group this large, it's it's a real special experience. It's a great pleasure to meet with families, and I think that this exchange, I like to think of it as a mutually rewarding experience. You know, donors, artifact donors get to see where material is going, get to see the material off to its future home where the items can be preserved and used, becoming part of the historical record. It's rewarding also for the curatorial team and the museum in that we come to know the story behind the artifacts. We learn the details about an individual beyond the uniform. These exchanges usually take place in offices or in meeting rooms, but occasionally we let you peek behind the curtain and see behind the scenes. And we're grateful that your family is willing to share this moment with each other and with our audience and our virtual audience as well. So thank you very much. I first became aware of the Killian letters in October 2021. I had to look back. And in the same way that I learn of many items, and that was through a phone call. And it wasn't from you, Jim, it was from Eugene Baldwin. He wasn't able to join us today, but he set it all in motion. And he was, a real champion of this collection. He spoke of the material, told me about it initially, and how valuable he considered it. And I didn't need much convincing. Shortly thereafter, I began corresponding with Jim. I was immediately drawn into the story of your father. His collection talks not just about the war, but about Black America in wartime. In very open, honest letters, a young man works through the complexities of personal relationships with his young wife, with superiors who are biased, and with the usual insecurities, frustrations, and loneliness that comes from being far away from home. So let's look at some photos, why don't we? And we can come back to any of these if y'all want to circle back later on, but I'm going to breeze through some photos here. Here you see James Kid Killian. This is during his this is in the pre-war period. He was quite the athlete, the basketball player. So to run through, he served for 6 years in the Army, from 1936 to 1939, and then again from 1942 to 1945 during the war years. From June 1944 to December 1945, Staff Sergeant Killian was in Europe, in England and in France. He was often with the 31st 01st Quartermaster Service Company, and his path really wasn't an easy one to track. He was moved around, the company was split up and then reunited. Sadly, the movement and activities of non-combat units are often underdocumented, understudied, and underappreciated. Much of Staff Sergeant Killian's time in late 1944 and 1945 was spent in charge of a POW stockade in France, with nearly 2,000 POWs. In January 1946, he was able to reunite with his family, with his wife Hazel and son Jimmy Boy, born while he was overseas. So here you are, you see James Killian. On the picture on the right, that's a post-war image. You know about when that was taken? Any estimates, James?
Let's see, that's probably early 50s.
Early 50s, okay. Yeah, and then pictured to the left are James's brother Harold, his mom Lottie, and James Killian Sr., his father, Reverend Killian. James's mother, Lottie, was one of his primary correspondents. And the affection that he has for his mom and the admiration that he has for her oozes from the page. You know, it's really clear. He writes, you know, this is just a small excerpt from one of the letters to his mom. First, Mom, I want to request something. Could you write a little more often? I love to get long letters from you. So she sends him the material he asks for, newspapers and other supplies. He's asking for Noxzema and hair tonic. It's, you know, he is so close with her, and he also confides in her a lot of real frank information. So they had a very close relationship. And one of the main topics of his letters is his relationship with his wife, Hazel, your mom. He writes a lot about her and how much he loves her. I do love that girl so very much, and I figure I am doing my best to prove it. And then, of course, little Jim. Please pardon me, Mr. Killian. So, AKA the third or the grand dude. You have a lot of nicknames in this book. Little Jimmy. So he is, or Jimmy Boy Killian. You were also a subject of a lot of the letters, and your dad writes to your mom about how cute and fine, you're the cutest and finest baby. And he writes a lot about how he's waiting to get home, to see you, to meet you, to be your father. What you see on the right, what we're looking at, those are pictures of you. And then on the far right, artwork that was produced by German POWs in the camp that your dad was in charge of. So here we are. This is the return home and the family. These were referred to as the pre-Michelle images. But the post-war family, and they made up for lost time very quickly. But here we go. Here's the legacy of Hazel and James Killian Jr. and our speakers today. So I wanted to also, this is, of course, the book that you produced, Mr. Killian, of your father's letters, and that is your editor and the champion of this material, Eugene Baldwin. And that was on the Juneteenth celebration in James Killian Park, is that correct?
That's correct, about a week ago.
Yeah, and that was the 20th anniversary that you had celebrated Juneteenth.
That's correct.
So I'll jump to this. This is one of my favorite passages in the collection. And this photo, I think, kind of sums it up. This is a post-war photo, but one of the things your dad writes about, and Colonel Crane touched on this, is the desire to get home and get on with life. And he says, I want this war to hurry and end, and I want to hurry and get home because I'm sick and tired of being overseas. I want to eat out of a plate, flush a toilet, sit or jump to music of a radio, go and see big bands. He wants the normal life. He wants to be home and done with it. And I thought he could have added, I want to wash a dog, because that seemed like I think that's what you're doing there, washing the family dog. So, your dad was a soldier. He was a family man. Your parents were married for 56 years. He was a brother, a son. He was a very active member in the church and with the American Red Cross. He was a steel worker, a union man. Rather than give a detailed history of his service, I'd like to focus on the collection, his letters, his words, and I would like to allow you, his children, the time to reflect on your dad's service and his legacy. So I'll start with you, Mr. Killian. You're a part of the war baby generation born while your dad was away in service. Do you remember that time when your dad came home from the war?
No, I don't. I was about, I guess, just under 2 years old. I don't remember an actual physical interaction, but I do remember when he first landed in the United States. My mom and grandmother called him on the phone, or he called them, and they tried to get me to make a noise or talk or cry or something, so my grandmother pinched me, and I let out a big yelp. So that was our first interaction.
So for the rest of you born after your dad returned home, did you know he was a veteran? Do you have memories of him talking about that?
I know he was a veteran because he talked about it. He did talk about it, and he brought pictures home with him of different historic sites in France. I don't know if, obviously he didn't photograph them himself, but he did. I'm glad he came home. I'm so glad he came home. And I think he came home because he had a deep faith. He was a God-fearing man, and that faith brought him home to us. And I'm grateful. Thank you, Daddy.
So let's talk about the discovery of these letters. It's how we have learned to get to know your dad and what's brought us here today. So did you always know they were there? When did you first learn of the letters?
Well, first of all, throughout our lives, he talked about his experiences. And it's interesting, once the letters were discovered, we found out that we knew we knew the content because he had told us these stories. He was a great storyteller. And then my grandmother had the letters. Okay, my dad, throughout his life, never mentioned them. Didn't realize that they were still available. So once my grandmother passed away, they passed on to his brother, my Uncle Harold. And then when Uncle Harold passed away, then I had the letters. I was the keeper of the letters. And the letters were they were among a bunch of family photographs. And the letters were starting to break down a little bit. So I talked to my sisters and said, I'd like to share these with you. I got to find a way to copy them or for distribution. You got to read this. And finally ended up digitized the letters. Actually worked with Eugene Baldwin, and he helped, we actually translated them from reading them into a software app, and they actually converted it into text. And once I had that, I looked at that and I said, I could share these now. And then all of a sudden I had the bright idea, maybe I could just put this in a book. And I decided to actually put those text messages, the letters and text, into a book and surprise them as a Christmas gift. And worked very hard. Eugene was very helpful in helping me put that together and got it done and handed it off as a Christmas gift this past Christmas.
So what did y'all think? Were you surprised?
Totally surprised. I don't want to be the only one talking.
Right.
Letters are often very personal items, and I know, is it difficult to you to see your family's history, or maybe read some personal things in that way? See it as history?
It was a treasure for me, and I read the letters over and over again. And just most of the letters were addressed to my grandmother, but one in particular was addressed to my grandfather. And I really treasured that letter because it was my grandfather's birthday, and he wished him a happy birthday and told him how much he loved him, and he called him a perfect dude. So I didn't even know that language. You use that to call people a dude. But I really, he really expressed his love for his dad. And again, it was bi-directional, and you can just, so I read them over and over again and find something new each time, even though we knew many of the stories.
And as far as the person, after the Christmas experience, friends and associates were made aware of the book, and they all of a sudden, I want a copy, I want a copy. So that posed another decision. Should I make it available to the public? And so I didn't really want to do that because of the personal aspects and because it was so personal. Sisters talked me into doing it, said it's history, it's real, let it go. And so then we did a second edition, and this is the edition that we have available for purchase now.
And everybody needs coaches like your sisters. Like it's personal, but you know it's also history, and people can learn from it. So let it go. It's something you touched on, Dr. Killian, was the contemporary language in your dad's letters. In particular, when he writes to his brother, I think when he writes to Harold, he uses, he'll write about, he signs it your bro, your bro, your bro Jim. And he does talk about, when he writes to your mom, what's cooking? They're very open, honest, but also, you think, wow, they're really relatable contemporary letters. And this passage, it's also very descriptive, He wants to eat out of a plate and flush a toilet, a luxury like that, imagine. You can really get a sense of who he was and also your family, your grandparents. So your father clearly left a strong legacy. He, not only with his service, but with his post-war life and his service to the community. The park in Alton that we showed a photo of from the Juneteenth celebration, that's James Killion Park. It's near where he grew up, that's correct. And we can learn a lot about your father through the letters that we have here. But what are some of the things that you would like to share with us about your dad that are not contained in the letters? Some of his legacy.
Something specifically that I noticed in the letters, along with the language that stuck out with me because I wasn't even thought of, when he was asking my grandmother for some money for some whiskey. As I was growing up, I never saw my father intake any alcohol. I didn't see it. And I never heard him talk about it. I'm like, wow, Daddy wanted some whiskey? But what got to me, and I had to think about how old your father was at that time. He was 17, 18 years old, and he was relatable. As he grew and matured, he was very relatable to young people. Throughout the book, he talked about reading letters for other soldiers who were illiterate and helping them read the letters from home. And that sense of compassion carried on into his adult life. He mentored young people in the community, and he just, in the church, and he was just always that kind of dude.
I just wanted to share, when Cheryl and I were teenagers, preteens, we went to a football game with a friend of the family, a young man that my father trusted. He drove us to the football game, and we were supposed to be home by 10 p.m. So this trusted friend said, let's go to the club, to the Blue Eagle Club, which was a teenage club. So we're like, okay, Daddy won't mind, Mama won't mind, because we're with Clarence. So he drove us to the Blue Eagle, and we're there kind of commingling and dancing, and all of a sudden, somebody said, Carol, Cheryl, there's your daddy. They were like, what? And of course, we were embarrassed, and he came in. He said, I just wanted to know that you were all right. Carry on. And he left. that demonstrated to us he didn't totally embarrass us. He didn't reprimand us. He didn't punish us. He didn't say, come home with me now. He told us to carry on. And that kind of shows you his character. That's just who Daddy was. He was a wonderful man, and just can't praise him enough, and so proud that we've come to this point in time, this legacy he has left. And it would be transmitted to all of the kids, the grandkids, and we're just so proud of that. And I just wanted to share that little tidbit about him.
And one message I'd like to, just outside of the Army military experience, as a young man ready to graduate from high school, my parents instilled in me, hey, go to college, get your education, you can be anything you want to be. And I would always push back and say, yeah, but some of the things that I'm thinking about I'd like to be, I don't see anybody that looks like me in that role. And he said, you get your education, you work on that, I'm working on the other. And he was a very significant civil rights and community activist. And he was always fighting to open doors for minorities, especially black minorities. He was always opening doors, uplifting people, and that always took root while he was in the military. As mentioned earlier, he would actually write letters home or help guys write letters home that weren't totally literate. He would help them do paperwork, and then after he left the service, he did the same type of thing at the steelworks as he was a union leader. So that's one of the things that really stuck out with me as far as his interaction with me and some of the messaging that he instilled in me.
He was a great mediator. And he mentioned in one of his letters that he thought about the ministry, but he also was interested in law. And in his role at Laclede Steel, he served as a shop steward. He helped mediate work issues between the laborer and management. And he mediated in our family. And I think one thing that I really enjoy about my father and my mother, they were democratic. So we had family council meetings. And so he would allow us to speak. We had voice in the family. Now, we didn't always get our way, but he would allow us to plead our case. Like, if you want a bigger allowance, that's a possibility. But now here are some additional tasks that you might want to consider if you're going to get that additional amount. But he was always very calm and always there, and his strength was in we had terrible storms in the Midwest, tornadoes and all of that, and you just felt safe with him in physical kinds of things and emotional ones. And I remember him during the times of family when our maternal grandmother died, how strong he was. He just pulled the family together, kept us, made all the arrangements and did everything. And we lived in a small house. He did everything and made everyone feel as best that we could under the circumstances. And then he left the room. And then this was the first time I heard my father cry. So we heard.
Speaking of being
Heard him sob. We could hear him sobbing from the basement.
Speaking of being democratic, sometimes we would get into mischief and we wouldn't admit who had done it. So democratically, all of us would get punished. So if it was your turn to wash the dishes, no, it's not my turn, it's her turn, it's Cheryl's turn, it's Jimmy's turn. He said, okay, all of you all get in there and get those dishes done. He just did that. He didn't single us out. He just, okay, all of you are going to take care of this. And yes, we did get punished sometimes for misdeeds we did. I was the one who got punished the least, though.
So the next gen in the audience, have they carried out these democratic principles of family? I see some nods, but some shrugs. One of the words that has, or descriptions of your dad that I've read a lot in this material and heard referenced when talking about him is bridge builder. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? We've touched on it, but
yeah, he. One of the things that really helped him, the thing that's so, let me back up, the thing that's so unique in the book or the letters is that you can see evidence, personality traits, and things that he did while he was in the service that really had a bearing on how he operated or how he lived or interacted after the service. And one of the things that one of the reasons he joined the service in the beginning, he dropped out of high school in the 11th grade because he was so frustrated because he couldn't participate in certain activities, and he just felt like a second-class citizen. So just like so many other black men at that time, black young men, they would join the service because there was an opportunity for respect, to do something, fight for the country, and be respected and have somewhat a feeling of equal status. Okay, so it started with that. Then he found out that it wasn't quite that way. So he learned how to work through that during his years in the service. So once he got out and he became an employee of the Laclede Steel, and he became a union leader, a union officer, he learned how to negotiate, and he learned how to develop win-win situations. So he would, instead of just always throwing bricks to get attention and leaving it at that to the other side to react, he learned how to throw that brick to get attention, but then to step forward and negotiate so that both sides understood the value of reaching a common ground. And that's why we allude to the bridge builder annotation, yeah.
He was, as far as a bridge builder, he was involved in everything in the community. He met no strangers. He was a super politician in my, I'm like, Daddy, you always have to talk to everybody. I was young enough, I had to tag along to all those dinner meetings and all those union things, and he was just everywhere. And I just recall a story when I was in college. I was driving back home. A friend had come to visit me, and we were driving back, and I got a flat tire. Well, Daddy had taught me how to change a tire, so I knew how to do that. So we were along the side of the road, and my friend was freaking out because it was countryside. There was nothing around. And so I was changing the tire, and a car drove up. There were two young men in the car, and they proceeded to flirt and mess with us. And my friend was just about to freak out. And where are you coming from? Going from Carbondale to Alton. Oh, you live in Alton, so do we. And, it got a little harried. And, well, what family? I'm a Killian. Really? What Killian? Who's your people? My father is James Killion. They stopped. They told me to drop everything. We got this. They changed my tire. Everything changed. They asked that I would please tell my father. They gave their names, that they changed my tire for me, and please tell him, please tell your daddy, please. When I got home, I did tell Daddy what happened and that they changed the tire. He was like, okay. He was involved in the Urban League, and he, I think, was responsible for getting one of them a job. So they were, his name just rang throughout the Alton and surrounding areas, and he was involved in, he was a volunteer for the Cancer Society, and he just did everything to help people, He was about justice and making sure things were as they were supposed to be. He wanted to make sure that we were respected and to demand our respect. To make sure we stayed in our rightful, respectful places, which was at the top. He said, claim that. He always taught us, he was like, I don't know what he told you guys, but he told me, he said, you have to do more. You have to do more. He said, you're just as good as anybody else, but you have to do more. And I've always kind of thought about that, meaning don't be mediocre. Always push to do more. Always be better than what you are and where you are. And I just love that. Mom did too, and they pushed us in a loving manner.
Yeah, we talked a lot about your dad, but what about your mom? She was a partner in those.
She was a queen. My mother was a queen, and my father was the king. He treated her as such, and she treated him as such. And I have nothing but, I am so grateful to God for the family that he put me in. And I'll leave that there.
Yeah, I'll just say something about that too. As his post-war career evolved, she was right there supporting him along the way. I mean, they were partners, but she pushed him. He was out front. In their later years, as he retired, then she stepped up. And then she became the same type of community leader that he had been. Yeah. She became, everything you've heard about in the last couple of comments, she took that role. Yeah.
And it seems maybe in the letters in the wartime period, she was up on she was taking that front spot, you know. She was beginning to raise you, and she was on her own, and he was maybe a little unsure of how. He was anxious to get back and get started in it, but she was taking the lead at that time, so that's a...
She didn't walk behind him, she walked beside him.
That's right. What would your dad think if he were here today, you know, to see his wartime letters go into a museum collection? What do you think he would want us? What do you think he would say or feel about that?
He would be humble. He would probably be walking around in the audience, introducing himself and just getting to know people. He would be honored. He would be thankful and grateful, and he would express that. And he wouldn't do it flamboyantly. He would just do it as a gentleman should.
And just another statement on that. I look at today's generations. He was the type of man that did things for the good of the situation and to elevate people. He didn't do it for recognition, and so he would be honored by the recognition, but it wouldn't be anything he would strive for. Yeah.
Well, I do want to talk about, you know, just circle back one moment to the idea that your father, it's so interesting that we're learning him, you know, learning about him through his letters, and he also was a letter facilitator. You know, he made that kind of connection possible for other people as well, and that's something that we have heard, you know, carried on throughout his life. So that's an important note to add. I think the possibilities with these letters are numerous, endless almost. They have significance for the redesign and expansion of an exhibit that we have on the African American experience in World War II, Fighting for the Right to Fight. And the title of that exhibit is drawn from Killian's cousin. So Tuskegee Airman Colonel William Holloman. We have an oral history with Colonel Holloman, whose mother is a Killian, I hear, and Colonel Holloman is also a recipient of the Killian Family Lifetime Achievement Award, which in itself, that the idea that your family has this honor and takes the time to honor family members is just an amazing inspiration. But Colonel Holloman said about his experiences in World War II that he had to fight for the right to fight. And so that we've adopted that as the title of our exhibit on the African American experience in World War II. So we are redesigning and expanding that show. And so having first person accounts, personal correspondence like this is very important. The style and honesty and openness of the letters, you know, whether he's writing about homesickness or about prejudice or about the St. Louis Browns, you know, they make these letters very accessible and relatable. And that's something that is of tremendous value, especially we hear from teachers, from educators, students, and curators, you know, as we search for material. Along with oral histories, letters are also the vehicle for much of our interpretation of the war, how individuals narrated their own experience. So as you go through the museum, you see countless examples of oral histories and personal reflections. But letters, you know, provide this insight, how individuals narrated their own experience and to how they interpreted it to others while it was still going on. So they didn't know the outcome necessarily. They didn't know the future. You know, your dad hoped for this moment. He had these things that he wanted to do, but it was still uncertain. Personal correspondence is at the heart of the story of an upcoming initiative here at the museum called Expressions of America. It's presented by the Bob and Dolores Hope Foundation, and it will premiere in November, this upcoming Veterans Day. It is a multimedia projection mapping show that will be presented at nighttime on the museum's campus. And the Killian letters arrived at the perfect time for this project. We're pleased to incorporate a passage from one of Sergeant Killion's letters into the chorus of voices that's woven throughout the script of that show. And it is, in my opinion, one that's quite moving as well. He talks about the rainy season. We're coming on another rainy season, and what a lonesome time that is. He had such a way of expressing himself. There's a lot of, you know, the fun, the dude, and take it easy man, but he had a seriousness and thoughtfulness about him as well. So we're really honored to have this collection and to be able to incorporate it in numerous ways throughout the campus. So I want to thank you all on stage. Thank you for coming, and thank you all in the audience for joining.
So thank you, Kim, Jim, Carol, Cheryl, and Michelle for the incredible conversation highlighting your father's wartime experience as documented through his correspondence. We're grateful to your family for gifting that legacy to the World War II Museum. So if you will, at this time, would you join me in the middle of the stage to officially hand over the correspondence to the archive? Go back to the microphone here for one last moment. Again, thank you, Jim, Carol, Cheryl, Michelle, for preserving these letters, gifting them to us to share with future generations. What I set up here is that researchers are going to have access to this from now on, and that's an amazing legacy to leave. But you can find Jim's book. Notice how we're sliding this sales piece in here. I'm in front of a vice president of sales there. You can find Jim's book, A Black Soldier's Letters Home, in our museum stores during regular business hours and eventually on our online store. I've been reading them, and they're everything that we've been talking about. So thank you for joining us this morning, both in person and those joining us virtually, as we look forward to seeing you again soon here at the National World War II Museum. And for those that are here with us today, we're going to be going into the Louis Armstrong room for a reception. So thank you for joining us, and thank you.